like to call to order the local planning agency meeting. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us. I'm going to have everybody stand for the pledge, and while we do that, I'd like to take a moment of silence for the victims in Israel. Just bow our heads, please, and just take a moment and think about the poor men, women, and children. I saw a horrible video the other day that was not edited, and what I saw,
I saw one this morning too, something.
I thought I saw a lot as a law enforcement officer, but these people were murdered in cold blood, and it was horrible. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. We do a roll call, please.
Sure thing. Chairman Maturo.
Here.
Vice Chairman Lowen.
Here.
Member Lombardo. And he asked to be excused. Member Bornstein.
Yeah.
Member Doogie.
Here.
Member Cola Pietro. And he also asked to be excused today. Member Townsend. And he's our newest appointed member, and I know he had said he was traveling.
Okay,
We do have a quorum.
thank you. Any public comments? Seeing none, we'll move on. We're going to have a review of the following land development code amendments for consistency with the City of Bonita Springs Comprehensive Plan. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, everybody. Mike Fegon with Community Development for the record. So as you have before you is a copy of proposed amendments to a portion of the city's wireless communications facilities ordinance, also known as our cell tower ordinance. The specific section that we're looking to amend is 4-1221 that has to do with the development regulations for cell towers, more specifically the height allowances for cell towers. Just to kind of give you a little bit of a backstory, earlier this year, I think it was either February or March, myself and John Domer, our development director, we were invited to a meeting of the city's Technology Advisory Board. And it was at that meeting that they proposed that the city's cell tower ordinance be amended. The concerns that they had at that meeting were that the height allowances that were in the code were a little bit too stringent, and that allowing more flexibility in terms of height that's allowed by right or administratively would yield a positive benefit to the city. The ordinance hadn't been amended since 2015. That was the last time there was a significant rewrite of the cell tower ordinance, so it has been some time to their point. On the staff perspective, we haven't had much pushback on the ordinance overall, and we haven't had any conflict with the cell tower companies regarding the heights that were proposed as written. So the way it was originally intended was that essentially if you were in a residential area, just as an example, you could have a maximum tower height of 35 feet administratively. Anything higher than that required a special exception, so it required going to the zoning board and city council for review and approval. So essentially it involved the public hearing process. And then you can see on page 1 of 6 in your packet where we start crossing out and highlighting things, the changes that are being proposed based on the land use category, starting with residential up top, then commercial, then industrial, so on and so forth. And the recommendation that was provided by the Technology Advisory Board was that essentially, regardless of the land use, let's go ahead and create a situation where you're allowed a tower height of 125 feet by right. No public hearing needed. So you would still go through your permitting process. This doesn't exempt them from that, but it would save them a lot of time in terms of going through a hearing process, probably some money as well, and just make it a more expeditious review for them to get from point A to point B. So 125 feet is what was requested by the Technology Advisory Board, and by City Council also had a brief discussion on this that wanted staff to go ahead and pursue these amendments. So that's what brings us here today. So the changes are really in the column that in the column that discusses maximum allowable height by administrative approval, going to 125 feet across the board, and then in the other column for special exception, anything from 125.1 feet all the way up to 149 feet, give or take, would still require that special exception approval. So that encompasses the bulk of the changes. Another change that is being requested, which is more of a cleanup change, is on page 4 of 6, that has to do with the buffering requirements for these cell tower facilities. As I'm sure most of you know, it's not just a tower that sticks out of the ground. There's also a lot of equipment on the ground, backup generators, things of that nature that are usually behind some type of fence or enclosure. And we have standards for how to buffer that fence and enclosure to make it a little less obtrusive to the eye. This just cleans up that language. It's not really a huge change per se. Essentially what's proposed is the way it's been enforced anyway. So this just cleans up and clarifies some of that language. And then there's also a few sections where we removed some code sections that were throwbacks to previous iterations of the code that are no longer applicable. So that encompasses the bulk of the changes before you.
Anybody have any questions?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bob.
How many cell phone towers are in the city, and how many are in residential?
We probably have, give or take, between 20 and 25 towers. And that doesn't just include standalone towers. That also includes, for example, out on Hickory Island, we have several condo buildings that are pretty high that have cell tower antennas on their roof. So I'm counting those as well in that total. As far as ones that are located in residential areas, the ones on Hickory Boulevard, so that's probably 5 or 6 on Hickory Boulevard, give or take, maybe a few more. There was one that was approved in a somewhat residential area off of Terry Street back in 2019. So we're still talking just a handful of the 20 that are in actual residential areas.
But that's kind of high for 125 feet, kind of high for residential, isn't it?
I think an argument could be made that says that, yes.
Anybody else?
And you haven't had any public comment against this?
We haven't had any public comment against this. This is our first real test, was this meeting, to see what came out of the advertising for this meeting, and to date we haven't received any public comments against it.
That speaks for itself.
Before we move on, I'd like to welcome John. John, good morning, sir, and I'd like to recognize the mayor and the city of Bonitas. Thank you for being here, sir.
Do you think you'll get much feedback or complaints in the residential areas?
I think there could
I know
be.
if I lived there, I would complain.
I don't want to, be Nostradamus and try and be a predictor here, but I know that we have had issues where towers of a lower height were being proposed in a residential area, and the residences were able to get together and essentially squash it. So if I'm using that as a predictor of what could happen, sure, it could happen, but to date with these proposed changes, it hasn't come up.
Would language be appropriate in a residential area that if there were complaints, that the height would have to be modified?
So there, just some, the 1996 Telecommunications Act actually restricts the city from making decisions based on a lot of neighbors' complaints, because, a lot of the complaints will be specifically about any kind of radio communication will be getting signals, or it's causing cancer and those things. So we're actually limited on what we can consider in public comment. So I'd be leery of having any kind of de facto, public comment triggering a reduction. This was not, again, I think Mr. Fegon's pointed out, this was not something that was requested by any cell phone carrier companies. Nobody's come in with an application asking for additional height. This was a recommendation from the Technology Advisory Board because of just concerns in the community about cell phone reception.
I think the one controlling factor that we still do have in play that helps, especially in residential areas, is that regardless of the height, we limit the types of towers that you're allowed to erect in a residential area to stealth towers or camouflage towers. So those are towers that are essentially aesthetically designed to blend in more to the surrounding area as opposed to being just a big guy-wired industrial-looking tower. So we still do have those controls in place. It's the height that's being adjusted.
In your experience or opinion, do you think the complaints would be more just that there's a tower going up regardless of height, whether
Sure.
it's 35 feet or, okay.
Anyone else? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to make a motion to approve and,
Public hearing?
okay, anybody from the public want to speak? Mayor?
I see there's, out on Tower Road, there's a couple towers in town now. What are their heights? Are the existing ones over the limit, or,
Mayor, if you could direct your comments to the board, please.
how many towers are over 125 feet currently in Bonita
Let me
Springs?
direct that to John, or he's over there,
See,
Mayor.
there we go. All works.
I don't have an exact number of towers that are over 125 feet, but what I will say is that we do have several off of Tower Road that are major communication towers, like for Comcast and things like that, that are pretty high. We do have a tower that's, I think it's around 1,000 feet off of Old 41, near the dog track area. That's for the same thing. It's a major radio communication tower. We've permitted several that are within the 75 to 90 foot range, give or take. So the heights do vary. Like I said, we have a few that are on, some residential buildings out off of Hickory that are maybe 60, 65 feet high, give or take, or some of them are higher even. So it really does run the gamut of all types of measurements that you have throughout the city. And that's done based on that there's a few factors that play into that. So essentially the higher the tower, potentially the greater the signal, the farther out the signal can go, and also the more leasable space you have on the tower. So a lot of the towers that we have in the city aren't built by the cell phone companies. They're built by actual tower companies, and then they lease space on the tower to AT&T, Verizon, things like that. So those companies will put their antennas on the tower for service. So depending on, the strength of the signal and the desire to deal with certain coverage gaps in the city, that will also play a role in the height of the overall tower.
If the existing towers were those who own it, whether it be the cell companies or the tower companies, wanted to expand to the 125 feet, would they be allowed?
With the passing of this, if they were under 125 feet and wanted to expand, they'd be able to do it administratively. Right now, they'd be able to do it, but it would require a public hearing process.
And what happens if the community members where that tower is raised a fuss? What would happen?
Well, again, it would be taken into consideration as far as it would be part of the public record, but there's still a standard for review. There's a checklist of items that they have to submit. They have to show that they've done their homework. They have to show that that there is a gap in coverage, which is why the increased height is required, or which is why they're requesting the increased height, things of that nature. So there are certain boxes that they have to check just outright on the code. And if they check those boxes, staff essentially has to recommend approval because, like Derek said, we're somewhat precluded from just taking the concerns of residents with regards to height as a criteria for not approving the request.
So, if the residents of that community, say the entire group of residents,
Not yet.
hundreds of individual homeowners, objected, would you just dismiss that as out of hand?
So let me try to clarify the issue. Right now, the code says that you can have a telecommunications tower 75 feet in residential districts. That's as of right. So as long as the application meets the criteria, it can be the boxes are checked, it has the right setbacks, it meets all the camouflaging requirements, it can be permitted as of right. The proposal would be to allow that to go to 125 feet. If that happens, there is no public hearing, there is no public notice, it is just a permit that gets requested.
At that point in time, the tower goes up to 125, just below, an inch below. And 500 homeowners come to the city, to the mayor and the board of commissioners and say, hey, we don't want this. Would it be dismissed out of hand?
Unless the neighbors had could show that there was a defect in the permitting, in other words, they didn't check all the boxes required, they would have no standing to object. Now, that said, under the process that currently exists, if you see one of the same 125-foot tower, and it went to a special exception hearing, you could have 1,000 people, you could have 5,000 people. It's not a democracy, it's not a vote. It's a question at the hearings, is whether or not they met the standards or didn't meet the standards.
So, Mr. Mayor and his associates would dismiss it out of hand.
I wouldn't say that they would dismiss it out of hand. The issue is whether or not they have the legal requirements to deny a permit.
I understand that. Okay.
I'm gonna do a follow-up question to that. What would be the purpose if you have a 75-foot tower in a residential neighborhood now that you already have? What would be the purpose, or what would be the driving force to raise it 50 feet rather than finding another location to put a different tower?
So again, this is not an issue brought to us by the cell phone carriers. This is an issue
Sure.
brought. So the concern, I believe, is, and I've only participated in one meeting with the technology board, is generally cell phone coverage in the city of Bonita Springs is fairly poor. And higher towers would allow additional coverage and it would allow additional carriers to locate their antennas on those towers, which could blanket the city with additional opportunities. That I believe is the logic behind the request.
Mike, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Great presentation. Okay, now I'd like to make a motion to the amendment to this, amendment to City of Bonita Springs Land Development Code, Division 11, Section 4-1221, Development Regulations for Wireless Communications Facilities.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, that just passed. We have an update from July LPA meeting, LDC Chapter 9, Definitions and 7 Amendments, Dock and Shoreline Structures. Our next meeting's tentatively scheduled for November 16th, 2023. Everybody good with that?
Yep.
Yeah, Bob, you good?
She's gonna do an update on the dock.
That's not the week of Thanksgiving, that's the next week.
Week prior.
Week
Yeah,
prior
I'll
to.
be out of town on the week of Thanksgiving.
Okay, so you'll be here for
Yeah.
that. Go ahead, Jackie.
All right, good morning, Chairman and LPA members. The amendments that were heard over the summer were presented to City Council for adoption and they were approved. So changes to the Dock and Shoreline Code and the Sea Turtle Ordinance were approved.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A motion for the approval of the minutes from our last meeting.
So,
So-
All
Second.
in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Great.
No, I got a question.
Oh, Bob has a question.
I'm impressed by what's happening in downtown Bonita. It's starting to look very good, and hopefully that will continue. And especially since the city council changed the requirements for trucks not going between Dean and Terry, right? But how do the restaurants, et cetera, bars, get their deliveries then?
There's an exception to the code that allows on local deliveries.
Just through trucks.
Just can't be.
Can't be through trucks, yeah.
I don't know. Are we done? Does anybody have food truck quite? What do you have?
That's it, that was.
We're good. So thank you, everyone. Great presentation. Mayor, thanks for being here. John, always good to see you.